Good afternoon. We're thrilled that you guys could be with us, and we want to thank the Chamber for asking us to present. My name is Shandi Treloar, and I am Vice President at EM Partners. I have a background in emergency management for the last 15 years, and for the last about 5 years, Joel and I have been working on private sector issues across the U.S., specifically with the National Emergency Management Association. I serve as on the board for the National Emergency Management Association as their private sector chair. And I also sit as the private sector coordinator for the Electric Infrastructure Security Council. Joel, I'll hand it over to you.
Good afternoon, folks. My name is Joel Thomas, and I'm glad to be here. And welcome to our session, Engaging Private-Public Partnerships at the State and Local Levels. I'm the founder and CEO of Spin Global, a Maryland-based small business focused on disaster risk and emergency management. We provide services around the world, and our mission is to disrupt disasters from neighborhoods to nations. And we've been doing that in about 20 countries since we started, and neighborhoods all over the United States. And in particular, I'm excited to be here today because private-public partnerships is a big part of the work that we do. We're supporting efforts at local, state, national, and international levels, developing tools, guidance, resources, providing support to states and locals. So as Shandi mentioned, an area that is quite close to my heart and very interested in advancing. So really thrilled to be here at the 9th annual conference that the Chamber's put on, one of my favorite events of the year. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Shandi.
Great, thanks, Joel. So as everybody knows and has been engaged in this conference, the purpose is to build resilience through private-public partnerships. And I think that one of the things that this conference has been really able to drive over the last 9 years is that focus on resilience, pushing it forward and bringing together the organizations that can actually really take action for making that happen. So we're really happy to be here. So some of the things that we want to talk about today, some key questions that, as Joel and I have been working on these issues over the last 5-6 years, some things that have come up recently. So really, what is the current state of public-private partnerships? What does it look like at the state and local level? What does it look like at the federal level? How has that changed? What is the role of the public-private partnership in our current environment? So what does it look like from a COVID environment, and how have things changed? How can we organize our public-private partnerships so that we can build that resilience? And I think there's going to be a lot of examples from this COVID event that we'll be able to call on and show as examples. And then what opportunities are there for engagement? What opportunities exist between public and private? What have been misconceptions in the past that we can basically debunk so that folks can kind of get into the mode of knowing what those opportunities are and knowing when to recognize them? So Joel, go ahead and hand it back to you.
All right. So just to get started, I don't know how many of you were at last year's event, but I was, and there were 3 quotables that I felt were worth bringing up again. The first one is from Mami Mitsutori, who's the head of the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Office. And she said, mortality rates are going down, but economic losses are going up. We need to do more to reduce exposure to economic losses. And she said this in the context of work that she's doing globally. And she commented that alert and warning systems have advanced tremendously, not perfect, but tremendous improvement. She also commented that the life-saving ability of public and private organizations has improved dramatically. The capabilities are far more mature than they were in the last generation. But she said, those things don't go away. The life-saving mission doesn't go away. But the reality is that the big challenge of this generation, one of the big challenges is that economic losses are going up, and we need to figure out a way to improve economic resilience, improve the way that we adapt our systems, and private-public partnerships are a key part of that. The second quote that I found particularly interesting last year was from Cesar Vargas from Anheuser-Busch. He said that the future of resilience is about a shift from response to preparedness, and I might add mitigation. And I think that at the end of the day, as an industry, emergency managers, whether private or public, we're often too reactive. There's so many things going on and so few resources. We aren't taking the time necessary, as evidenced by our bank accounts and where we spend money. We're often spending still way more on response and recovery than we are in resilience. I can't wait for the study on COVID-19 that somebody will do someday that says, here's how much money, how many trillions we would have saved if we had been better prepared. We wouldn't have eliminated all the losses, but how many trillions would we have saved if we had been better prepared as a nation or as an entire global group of global citizens? And then the last point that I thought was really significant, because again, it has to do with investment being made proportional to the other. And that is General Terrence, I can't pronounce his last name, from the US Northern Command. He said private investment in research and development has actually surpassed the Department of Defense's research and development investment for technological innovations. He said last year this was a significant change, a big change from the historical norms. And he then called us to embrace the fundamental change in private-public partnerships, seeing that the amount of infrastructure, resources, financial investment that's taking place in the private sector by necessity is increasing. And where we've had generations looking at sort of the role of really resilience or emergency management, it's homeland security as an inherently governmental function. We're seeing the shift of balance and the center of gravity move, or at least acknowledge where it already has been, looking at the role of government to convene and coordinate, and the role of the private sector in terms of service delivery, capability delivery in many cases. Obviously, there's still need for both. But I think these three statements really frame a couple key thoughts that we'd like to talk a little bit more about today. Shandi, I'll turn it back to you.
So before we move on, I just want to make a point. Joel and I like to be interactive. So if folks have questions while you're viewing our session, please feel free to send those via the chat. We will answer them, as we get them, but we don't necessarily want to wait until the end of the session or this presentation to answer questions. So what is the current state of private-public partnerships? There's opportunity for growth and maturity for sure. There's been an evolution in public-private partnerships that's really been happening, I would say, probably in earnest over the last 10 years and pretty quick paced over the last 5 years. There is somewhat of a lacked shared vision, definition, and structure. So at the federal level, there are different, there used to be different structures. It was very clear after the 2017 hurricane season that a shift in structure, specifically at FEMA and DHS, was necessary. And FEMA and DHS took those steps to make those changes and to put more structure behind it using their emergency support function structure. So when you look at the structures as well at the state and local level, each state and each locality has a different way of approaching private sector partnerships. And one of the reasons for that is because of the regulatory or legal requirements that they have to adhere to. So some states can engage with the private sector any way they want. Some have to do it through a procurement mechanism, just based on potential conflicts of interest. So different structures in different states, different structures in different localities versus different regulatory requirements will make those, the shared vision or the structures different. Let's see. The next one is, public-private partnership landscape at the local level. There's opportunities with economic development, who's engaging, how are they engaging, through emergency management. How is that occurring? Private nonprofit oriented, and then infrastructure oriented. So from a structural perspective, you may see some states are doing it through economic development. Some states are doing it through emergency management. Some states are doing it through a private nonprofit organization that is basically organizing all of the private sector partners together and liaisoning with the states. And then obviously the infrastructure oriented, which is a somewhat new structure coming out of FEMA for the critical lifelines. And then what we also see as a current state in public-private partnerships is that there is an overemphasis in response when it comes to coordinating the private sector. There hasn't been a huge push consistently across the board in doing the preparedness and the mitigation, as Joel mentioned earlier. Those are places that there are huge opportunities, again, for the growth and maturity of these programs. And we think that COVID has really catapulted these private sector partnerships into the spotlight, and that that creates a huge opportunity, and those will be more essential for building the social and economic resilience that we clearly need and we see right now. Joel, I'll go ahead and pass it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Shandi. Those are a great overview of some really important points. And I'd like to just add some additional points on to the same narrative. And that is, if you just take a step back, we're here talking about state and local private-public partnerships. But I want to take a step back because when we talk about the current state of private-public partnerships, it's important to acknowledge a couple of things. I just listened to Secretary Wolf talk about a core tenet of the national security strategy, wherein it says economic security is national security. We also had, as Shandi mentioned, a major update to our national framework, response framework, and in so doing it at a federal level, an emergency support function, and an office of business infrastructure, industry infrastructure integration that's been created within FEMA to coordinate the federal government interests. And that's important because as states and locals are looking at how to implement and mature and grow their programs, these are big signals in the community that says we're embracing the role of private sector in emergency management in a more deliberate, concrete way with policy, legislation. This was in many ways the response, the executive branch level and legislative branch level response to the disasters of the past few years. And it happened at no better time than right now. And then we've seen, as Shandi mentioned, with COVID, and as we heard, again, Secretary Wolf just talked about the wonderful examples of private-public partnerships, whether it be those first couple of weeks on the White House lawn when we heard the national stories of testing being created, surge created, the use of the Defense Production Act, the overseas Project Airbridge, where we're getting resources from the private sector and from around the world. These are all examples of the government inherently does not have the capability to solve the problems of 21st century disasters. It requires partnership. Without the private sector, we can't achieve resilience. We can't achieve the goals in the response in a disaster. And so the opportunity for growth and maturity, from my perspective, is if you look at a state level, there are a number of, Shandi mentioned the National Emergency Management Association, and there is in the last year a new coordination group of private sector leads in the states that are inherently government employees. And there's a vast difference in the types of programs and the maturity level of the programs that exist. There are some that have a liaison, and it's maybe a quarter of their time to focus on private sector issues. And for some, it's a full-time dedicated position with a fully operational part of an emergency operations center that exists. And they're doing everything that is required therein. And so what's clear is we've got a lot of momentum. We've got policy, we've got some net federal frameworks, but at the state and local level, there's a big gap. There's a gap in standards, in guidance, in tools and resources. We've been part of efforts through various means at local, state, and national levels to solicit and collect examples of use cases and models and templates that people are using in an effort to understand what's working. And then, is there a way to actually develop a roadmap to scale those capabilities? Because from a state perspective, it's really about having the technical capacity to manage these programs. So from a private sector perspective, it's how and who do I coordinate with and at what level? There's different types of disasters that are all local at first, but at a certain point becomes a state managed or nationally, federally managed. And so for local companies, there's a different point of engagement than national companies. So how do we navigate those waters? And I think there's a real opportunity for guidance and some structure. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today. And when we talk about shared vision and definition, I've done a lot of research on this topic, and there are some examples and definitions of private-public partnerships that exist. We're going to propose one to you because I've never seen one for emergency management specifically. And we're going to propose one to you in a moment here, and would welcome your feedback to hear about what's right about it and what's missing. But I'll leave you with that cliffhanger for a moment while I opine for a second.
Bill, I just want to make one point that you mentioned, with the differences. I think one of the biggest gaps at the state and local level is the buy-in. And I think what COVID has taught us is that the buy-in is necessary. I have had a number of locales and states reach out to me and say, wow, we really need to get our programs together and figure out what we need, because they didn't have it before, or they had pieces of it and didn't know how to pull it together. And I think that the buy-in is going to grow more and more post-COVID or amidst COVID.
That's a great point. And I think what has been researched and documented for literally over a couple decades, the need for public-private, now private-public partnerships. And while there's been examples, to your point, there's within the whole industry, within the Homeland Security Emergency Management domain, there's been increasing buy-in. And this is one of those moments. I think it's a turning point where buy-in to the role of private-public partnerships, I think, is going to accelerate dramatically in this moment, because people are seeing exactly what you're saying, Shandi. And so we talk about the landscape, just a couple of comments there. The center of gravity for these partnerships doesn't necessarily always exist in the government or the private sector. It really is a joint effort. And I think the best models have that in play. And I also say that the center of gravity isn't necessarily in an emergency management organization. I mentioned state organizations, but economic development organizations. I'll give you an example here in the city of Fairfax in the National Capital Region. They have an economic development administration locally, and they've got this platform called Fairfax Connected, and it's really focused on businesses being connected. But because of COVID, they had to adapt. They realized that for businesses, they had to look at continuity and guidance for reopening, and they're partnering with the Office of Emergency Management now. So it's actually led by the Economic Development Group, which is a steady state. There's always economic development going on. They're not always necessarily having a disaster to deal with. But in the time of disaster, they're reaching out to the emergency manager in town, and also now looking at how do we engage the private sector constituents that we already have contact with. So, there are many such examples like that around the country. Another example I'll give you is in the state of Missouri. They had an unprecedented partnership that took place in the economic development districts after a major declaration. I'm reading a case study here. Together, the partners assessed the economic impacts of a major flood and the impacts to the local economy, to their infrastructure, and to their workforce. And this effort resulted not only in the resumption of business activity, but the creation of new economic activity, and included significant support and leadership from the Department of Economic Development and a newly established economic recovery support function. So here's an example again of the economy is leading here. It's in emergency managers, it's all about whacking molds. What mold do we have to whack today? And it's often response. And we talk a lot about resilience and preparedness, but I think that some of these economic development examples might be a great center of gravity in many communities for engaging private-public partnerships, from which and through which they can engage the emergency management and homeland security apparatus. And then, as we've talked about extensively, a lot of emergency management organizations have private sector programs, business emergency operations centers. There was actually recently guidance put out, a quick start guide from FEMA that was published last month. It's the first time I'd seen something published by FEMA on how to quickly get started a BEOC in a local jurisdiction. And so there's increasing evolution around the idea of emergency management sort of centric or coordinated private-public partnerships. And then as we've heard many examples in this conference in the past, private or nonprofit oriented, like Chicago First. It's a great example of a private nonprofit organization. They have a membership base where people pay to be part of that, and then they represent the private sector to industry and the government. And then there's many, many infrastructure-oriented projects, which are traditional PPPs that we've seen in the past. So as Shandi said, I couldn't agree more. I think we overemphasize the role of PPPs in response in national dialogue and narrative, and I think we need to shift to resilience. And because in many communities, they don't necessarily have a disaster to organize around every year or every couple of years. In many communities nationwide, resilience is something they can always be working on. So how do we take a resilience first approach that lends itself toward the relational capital, the organization, and the structural infrastructure capacity to facilitate response-oriented private-public partnerships? Did you have something, Shandi?
No, that's good.
All right, we'll go to the next slide here. If I can get this. So we mentioned previously a PPP, private-public partnership definition. Want to put this out, and if you're on the forum or in the chat, if you could share your thoughts and feedback, we welcome it. We want to crowdsource right now a definition. And since we lack some definition and structure at the state and local level, like I said, federal government has gotten their house more in order than ever before on this topic in the last year. There's still more, clarity needed, but here's a definition sort of for the masses. In the context of emergency management, a private-public partnership is defined as any type of cooperative arrangement between two or more organizations from private industry and the public sector, designed to ensure life safety, economic security, and the resilience of communities. Shane, do you want to share your thoughts on this definition?
Yeah, so I think this is great, and it encompasses all of the pieces of, Joel, conversations we've had over the years about, what do you need after a disaster? You need life safety and life sustainment. The economic security, that's the foundation in which you're building your communities and your partnerships. And then the resilience of the community is basically the result of those two things coming together. If we don't get a lot of responses during the session about the definition, we'll also throw a poll into LinkedIn so folks can comment, especially if folks aren't able to join this, we can post it in there, but we'll do that as well. I think that one of the key pieces, Joel, as you mentioned, is the not emphasizing enough on the preparedness and the mitigation. And I think those two pieces bring about that resilience. So those are things that we'll talk about in just a few minutes. So we did get one comment that says definition is on point. We appreciate that. And this is something that we will socialize with the state private sector leads, see what they think. We've been running a weekly call with them throughout this COVID event, and we'll have a conversation with them about what they think. And we can also send it out to other organizations, a lot of private sector partners that we know, and then work through the chamber to see if they can get, some buy-in on it as well. And maybe we can make this the definition for emergency management, or potentially, just public-private partnerships in general.
Absolutely. Okay, so we will continue to plow on. We welcome additional chats and comments. I've got a couple of text messages from people who are watching saying that they're also supportive of the definition. I welcome what's missing from this as well. Have we missed something? Have we misrepresented something? So as Shandi said, we'll move on for the moment, but we may come back to it at the end if we've got some additional time for dialogue. So one of the key questions Shandi raised at the outset of this conversation today was the role of private-public partnerships in our current environment. I'll turn it over to Shandi if you want to kick us off, and then I'll follow up.
Yeah. So taking the current situation with the next steps of what we're seeing, what have we learned, and then what are the next steps for leveraging what we've learned through the COVID environment? We have seen a number of disasters happening where, different organizations, different states, different federal agencies are taking advantage of their partnerships with the private sector. But not everybody has been afforded that opportunity. And unfortunately, this event has given everybody that experience and that exposure and that opportunity to engage with their private sector. And really the level of response and action that's taken place couldn't have happened without those partnerships. So really with the COVID task right now, we're focused on safeguarding lives and livelihoods. We're managing tensions by limiting trade-offs. We're focusing on preparedness and capabilities and resources for mitigating the impacts of the risk. So these are kind of the next steps. What do we do? We're slightly in a lull, but what can we learn from those engagements that we've had? If you take the resources that you have available to us out of the silos that they're currently in, so here's public, here's private, what do each do? And then you put them together, that's what's really going to create the resilience that we think is necessary for overcoming a lot of the issues that we've seen in past events. I think another piece that I always find interesting about a disaster is that during day-to-day operations, during blue sky time, everybody has their roles and responsibilities. They work perfectly, but for some reason after a disaster, public sector takes over. And instead of utilizing and leveraging the capabilities and the responsibilities and services that private sector typically do, they jump public sector jumps in and tries to overcome it. And I always share this example when I'm talking about private sector best practices. Is there was a state after a hurricane, and somebody came to her from the federal government and said, where do you want the points of distribution for commodities, MREs, water, ice, etc.? And this individual looked at the person and said, well, why are we putting up pods, is what they're called? And she said, we haven't heard from our grocers yet. Why would we put up points of distribution when my grocers can open? Why would we impact them in that way if they can provide that service and that capability? So those are things I think we're learning from this event, definitely. So what does that look like? What do we need to do? We need to manage risk. Public-private partnerships, they don't just exist in response. They need to focus on preparedness and mitigation, and it all needs to come together in the full cycle of emergency management. I think that, doing that, you do a joint assessment, you do joint planning, training, and exercise. There are a lot of states and localities that are doing those trainings and exercises in conjunction with their private sector, and that has helped bolster their capabilities and understanding of what is available to them during an event. We need to look at data-driven analysis of the environment. Joel, and I know you'll want to chime in here on this, but we have access to more data now than we ever have before. And we need to leverage that. We need to look at that. We need to analyze it. We need to determine how best we can do things based on what we know through data. And I'll pause there, Joel, just so you can kind of talk through data, because I know that the data is somewhat of a passion for you.
Yeah, I like data, and I was thinking about getting a tattoo perhaps. But no, actually, seriously, when we think about the imperative of our time, and I'll tie this to this graphic here on the left, which is from sourced by McKinsey, safeguarding lives and safeguarding livelihoods. Think about where we were in April and May, when the country was, we were learning about COVID, we were collecting numbers, looking at the cases and death rates, and we were looking at, producing massive amounts of personal protective equipment and testing and encouraging masks and whatnot. And the White House put out a strategy, and I think I read an article that not one governor implemented that exactly, which is for better or for worse. But everybody's sort of off to the races, forced by different realities, right? I think a desire to protect his health and safety, but also to protect livelihoods, realizing that the two are really not a conflict. The idea, CNN had an article saying deaths versus dollars. I think it's a false tension. It's really not. You need health and you need the economy working together. And I think, how do we move forward from here, where just this week we've got droves of states closing again, counties, cities closing again, and how are we going to reopen? And you see the role of data informing decision makers. And at what point and how do we use health data? We're seeing that dramatically improve here, in terms of our ability to collect data, understand the nature of COVID, but then also look at economic data and look at the impact to the economies, and how can we actually open economies in a safe and responsible way coming out of this. I was of the opinion the worst imaginable thing we could do would be reopen too quickly only to close again. That's a death wish for small business owners on Main Street. I know that. I've owned Main Street small businesses before, and it's a death wish. And I'm talking with my colleagues and friends who are saying this is worse than having just closed once in some cases. And so how do we make sure that we don't open, close too much? I think we have to take a data-driven approach and look at, well, if we're going to open responsibly, we need to do so by calculating sort of the risk that we're going to be reintroducing into the environment. You can do that and open up low contact businesses, medium contact, and high contact businesses, but doing so when you have the available testing, personal protective equipment, masks, whatever guidance in place, so that you can do so in a safe and responsible way. If you open too quickly and you don't have the resources available, which we're seeing some of the data come in from states where some of the states are behind on sort of their needs from testing, PPE, et cetera, perspective, that only puts us in a worse spot. So I think the role of data in our current environment is incredibly important. It's also a challenge because we're learning as we're going, and there's new data that's being brought to bear. So I look at this first bullet, managing risk of disasters versus managing the disaster itself. We're in this tension. We're seeing it play out in real time in a way that's really unprecedented, where we're having to manage the risk of future spread and worse impacts. We're also now managing the risk of multi-threats. People are preparing in the Southeast for coronacanes. How do we anticipate the impacts of hurricanes on and coronavirus, the nexus therein, on evacuation and sheltering and all sorts of other issues therein. To then, how do we also use data to manage disasters? So I think we need to balance these tensions. I think we need to get better at managing risk. I think we've spent so much effort as an industry on managing the disasters. I think we need to really improve as in the dialogue of private-public partnerships, how we manage risk using data, understanding sort of the baseline. Where do we start? Where are we going? What are the relative impacts and the decisions? What are the impacts those decisions are going to have on real people and the economy? So, Shandi talked a lot about the life-saving and sustaining, social and economic resilience. I think private-public partnerships absolutely are having not only economic impact, but social impact. When we talk about the need to engage the whole community and looking at how do we engage communities, I think well-run PPPs are a venue for diversity and inclusion, including businesses of all types of industries, whether they support community lifelines in the federal government, as the federal government speaks about, or critical infrastructure, or if they're just important industries to a community, and they're critical to that community, and without which that community is going to have significant challenges. So I think it really helps, to look through a broader lens than we have in the past. And I think the integration piece is critical. I want to talk about that for a minute, because I think when we talk about, there's a lot of preparedness efforts out there. Businesses go create a continuity plan. Governments creating plans. Businesses doing training and exercise. Governments doing training and exercises. I think there's a real opportunity to integrate our approaches from a resilience standpoint, which we'll talk about in a moment, but again, on the operational front. And I think we need to lean forward. This is the moment to really lean forward. We've seen that. We've seen businesses adjust and adapt their entire business models to create hand sanitizer, for example, or other necessary things. And so how can we further integrate and work together, realizing that their ability to adapt is affecting the social and economic resilience of the community as much as it's helping the response. And so I think the role is living in that tension of managing the risk and managing the disaster. Let's figure out how we can work together to mitigate those risks, identify, community targets on what those risks are. And then from a disaster standpoint, what are the stabilization targets? And really coalescing around those. On an industry level, it's going to look different based upon the type of industry. Restaurants are in a much different category than manufacturers, right? And so what does stabilization look like for restaurants? I've been a restaurant owner. The outlook is bleak, and especially with the closing. Again, this is going to be very difficult. So we really need to work together, private and public, to figure out how do we do this in a way that we can open and stay open in a safe and responsible way. And so I think that to me is, when I think about our current environment, we need the innovation and the thinking from everybody coming together on these topics.
Yeah, Jill, I'll just point out a couple of other things. You talked about, coming together and integrating. Again, it's getting out of the silos of the two components or the two partners and bringing them together. We've seen over the years a number of success stories where private to private, case studies have happened where people were so innovative and supportive and just did what they needed to do. Private to public, public to private, one really can't exist without the other. And I think once we acknowledge that and embrace that and bring in that true whole of community concept, is when we're going to be able to get past a lot of the misconceptions and myths that we've seen throughout the years. I also think that one of the key points that you kind of touched on was each community is going to look different. What Kansas needs to focus on for their economic resilience, recovery, response, whatnot, is going to be very different than New York. And I think once people also get past that, you can tailor, you can take the data, you can look at it from that lens that you need to look at it from, and determine what the needs are. Determine those stabilization targets, determine those strategies and priorities that need to be set to reinforce that resilient approach. We have a question that says, can we use data to quantify avoided costs? Those are key to making decisions, resilience, PPP investments. Joel, I know you've done some work on avoided costs. I know that this was a conversation that we had not only during the 2017 hurricane season, but the 2018 hurricane season in terms of economic impacts, economic impact analysis, economic benefit analysis, and then how best is that money going to be used?
No, that's a great question. Loss avoidance and being able to quantify that, I think that overcoming that barrier is the key to unlock real spending on mitigation and preparedness. I love what's going on right now in the country. We're spending more on preparedness mitigation, but it's a drop in the bucket to what I think is required. And I think when you start looking at economic indicators in a community, sales, jobs, gross domestic product, health of a business community, looking at the various indicators and indices that are available, you can quantify, a day in the life of how many wages prior to reopening. I was looking at things like how many wages are lost for every day of closure to a particular industry. You could get that down to a county level or even a block level and look at what are the wages lost. And then, okay, if we understand that, you can actually begin to quantify, if I was able to get those people back to work safely and responsibly, how would that impact the community? You can look at not only the wages, but the impact to tax base and all sorts of things like that. So absolutely, can you quantify impacts? You can quantify the impacts in terms of daily loss due to closure that's affecting the built environment. Obviously, if a building is destroyed, the social environment, if people are unable to work. I'll give you a couple statistics. Who was the most impacted by closures? The data says that 5 of 6 Hispanics are unable to work remotely. That should grab everybody's attention. Yeah. 4 out of 5 African Americans unable to work remotely. And so for those who are very comfortable and blessed to be able to have a job that wasn't disrupted, they're able to work remotely. Remember that there are demographics in our communities, and we can quantify those impacts. We know based upon data available, both publicly and privately available, what industries people are working in. You can quantify wages lost and translate that and look into sales volume over time. Economic data always lags, so you look at it week over week, month over month, quarter over quarter. But can you quantify it? Can you quantify that? Absolutely. And so our goal should be, as a community, accessibility to the ability to work. And the government has approached that, I think rightfully so, by looking at community lifelines. It's all about accessibility and the operational functionality of power, water, communications, transportation networks, without which businesses can't operate. And if the government focuses on, hey, let's make sure these things are stable and operational, that enables everybody working in a company or in a business to actually do their business. Sans, obviously, some people can operate without those, of course, but the vast majority of Americans require those. And I think that we can look at, if a community lifeline is down in an industry, if power is out in an industry and businesses are unable to operate for a period of time, you can absolutely quantify those costs. So what would it cost to make sure we've got a resilient power infrastructure or a resilient communications network? What would it cost? And if we invested whatever that amount is, how many days might that save us the next coronavirus, the next hurricane? I think absolutely we can do it. We're just not thinking that way. Most emergency managers and Homeland Security professionals are not trained economists, and most economists haven't looked at these issues. But right now, I think we have a moment where everybody's got the same problem, the same set of problems, or closely related. And so I think we have an opportunity to have fusion of thought, to have a merger of thought, and really think differently about these challenges. And can that then compel legislatures, mayors, governors to have the political will to invest where investment is needed? That's yet to be seen, and I think that's a question of leadership, which we'll pause on that one. I'll leave you with that.
So just to point that out, I think the investment is something that's important, and that's how you quantify those avoided costs. Is you figure out what would I lose versus what if I invest ahead of time to mitigate the impacts. And I think that's, that's $1 million question, no pun intended. But I think the hardest thing to get over for that is we're investing in a what if, right? And I think what COVID has helped us understand is this is the what if. This is that crazy scenario that someone wrote when we were doing H1N1 planning years ago and said, it can't really happen, but let's plan for it. It's happening. So you can't say that we won't have black sky events. You can't say that we won't have another Katrina or Sandy. You can't say that the Cascadia subduction zone isn't going to happen, because they're all possible. So really taking that to heart and preparing for those what ifs is really going to get us to the point where we can look at those investments, look at the cost of the impact versus the cost of mitigating those impacts. Jill, we have another question that says, as an organization that can bring value to PPP efforts, how do you recommend we engage with national, state, and local entities? And I'd like to take a first stab at answering this question, because I think it really is the basic question that a lot of people ask us is, where do we start? And I would recommend, as an organization, you look at your community first. You start with your community. Who are the leaders? Who are the people who are responsible for responding or responsible for taking charge during an event, whether it's a disaster or even just a community event that's happening? Start at the local level. Get engaged with your local chambers of commerce. Get engaged with your local government. Build those partnerships. Make those phone calls. And the one answer I gave at a previous conference was pick up the phone. Just pick up the phone. From the state level, obviously, if you are an organization that has footprint across different states, reach out to your different states that you have footprints in, and again, build those relationships. Get involved with some of the associations at the state and local levels. That has been the best way that we have found to engage with government entities as well as other private sector partners. And then at the national level, obviously being engaged with the U.S. Chamber, organizations like the National Emergency Management Association, the International Association of Emergency Management, a number of different organizations. There's infrastructure organizations. Get engaged in those and start building those relationships. It's all about figuring out who needs what, who those people are that are making decisions, and then cultivating the relationships.
Yeah, and I'll just add, National Association of Counties has a private sector focal point. IAM has a PPP caucus. NEMA has a private sector committee. And if you're a national company, join the National Business Emergency Operations Center.
Yes.
You should absolutely join that. You can email them. I have another email, nboc@max.gov. So, join them. I think there's lots of opportunities. We do have another question that I think is a good segue into our next slide. What structural changes do communities need to become more resilient? And how do PPPs play a role? So that actually leads us toward one of our major themes today. And how do we orient? We mentioned earlier, PPPs are in emergency management, homeland security are overly focused on response, and we need to pivot toward resilience. And how can we do that? And we've got several things that we'd like to talk about here. In recent years, many communities around the world, in the U.S., states and cities have developed resilience strategies. Not everybody has them. 100 Resilient Cities was part of seeding that effort. There's other similar efforts that exist. Some states and locals have just taken it on their own to develop a resilience strategy. And now a lot of those are looking at, well, what's our implementation plan? A strategy is great, right? Let's convene everybody. What's the action plan? I think private-public partnerships should absolutely figure out in their community if there's a group or a coordinating body that has a strategy or an action plan. And if so, become part of that. And if not, join that effort. Another area, and we've talked a little bit about this, is comprehensive economic development strategies. I think that when you look at communities are often looking at how do we grow our community, how we grow our tax base, how do we make this a safe environment. And when we're coming in as Homeland Security and emergency management professionals, we need to be mindful that communities already have set priorities for themselves in terms of what economic development looks like. Economic development is a long game. It's years and years and years. When we're looking at the role of private-public partnerships, we shouldn't just come in with our own ideas. We should align with and support and amplify the work that is existing in communities that's been going on for, in some cases, generations. And how do you build on that and leverage that and then augment that with by highlighting aspects that haven't been addressed in those particular communities? I think a good starting point is to understand and analyze the development strategies. A great example, take a look at, I'll jump to a bullet that's ahead here and tie it together. This second to last bullet, can we use disaster recovery funds to support economic development priorities? I think, when I look at a place like Puerto Rico, they have a $100 billion economy, right, before the disaster. And I don't know what the number is right now. Let's call it 50 billion that the government's going to pump into that economy. And that's massive. If you're an economist, you're looking at that, you're like, whoa, all this money coming in, how is that going to help and not hurt the community, right? Are we going to prop up and inflate something, or are we going to push through projects because they check the boxes of our emergency management disaster recovery approach and the way that we know doing business? Or are we actually having a consultation with the state government and the local governments and saying, what are your priorities? What's your economic development strategy as an island? And this applies everywhere around the country. I just use Puerto Rico because it's a vast amount of money getting pumped in by the government for disaster purposes. And yet, if we aren't careful, we could send things down a road that nobody wants to go. But the opportunity is, there's a real incredible opportunity for the disaster to become a real blessing in that community. And there's opportunity born in chaos. And so, can some infrastructure and some things get fixed that were never quite working? And can that be done in a way that comes alongside? And it's not, hey, here, we're helping you out, whether you're a private public partnership or the government or private sector. It's, hey, how do we come alongside you and what your vision is for the future of your community? And I think that we need to be smarter. We need to look at the laws. We need to look at the processes. We need to look at the way we prioritize and spend and track the effectiveness of our funding, because a lot of times it's, have we spent or not? Did a project get started or not? There's often not time in recovery offices or field offices to really do it correctly. They always, the old adage, there's never enough time to do it right, but there's always enough time to do it a second time, right? So how can we be more strategic in the stewardship of funds? And I think, emergency managers are managers of funds, and we don't train to that well enough, in my opinion. And I don't think we equip people well enough to think about the strategic role that the industry has in communities and the role of private-public partnerships in achieving those ends in sustainable ways. So, I think looking at how we orient PPPs toward resilience has a lot to do with not just following the money, but shaping how the money is spent and invested in communities toward mitigation, toward preparedness. Every community that's got a resilience strategy should be identifying mitigation targets. I'll highlight another point, and then I'll hand it over to Shandi. The BRIC program, the Building Resilience in Communities program, fantastic opportunity for private-public partnerships. There's even a requirement, I think, for the mitigation projects that are submitted to have PPPs involved for these $10 million projects in a community. Government and private sector should be working together to set what are the priorities in our community that need to be mitigated. And then the private-public partnership should work together to figure out how can we collectively work on those mitigation priorities in a community. And let's leverage the BRIC program to get there. It's a great way to move the ball forward. And by the way, the relationships, the partnerships that are built in that context are going to be immeasurably valuable when something bad actually happens and there is a disaster. You can quickly pivot those partnerships, day-to-day partnerships, into an operational response type of mode for a while, as long as is needed, or into a longer-term recovery or really resilience building effort in the long term. So I'll pause there and I'll let Shandi weigh in on this slide.
Yeah, I think those are all really important, Joel. And I think one of the things we talked about previously is the data. How can we look at the money that is there? What are the economic impacts of what happened? What are the economic impacts of the funding coming in? And how do you strategically look at how the funding's being spent? I know that when North Carolina was looking at how they were going to spend their CDBG money, which is the Community Development Block Grant, post-disaster funding, how are they going to overlay that with the funding coming from the FEMA Public Assistance Program? And how can you maximize both of those funding sources to do and take action for mitigation efforts, doing the best for the community, helping them become more resilient. Also looking at it from an equity or diversity and inclusion perspective. I think those are things that, you know, we're seeing right now through COVID is the funding coming from HHS versus the funding coming from FEMA. You know, what can those be used for? How do you maximize both of those funding sources to do what you can do in your community to build that resilient foundation? So those are things. And again, if the term strategic planning can be somewhat overwhelming, especially for smaller communities or states. And I think that, you know, looking at what the resilient strategies and actions are from those 100 cities perspective, looking at those and using those as an example, as you know, just a starting point. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of examples and opportunities to tap into other, you know, communities that have done this and learn from them. You know, so reach out to other communities that have done that. And it's not just about having goals and objectives, it's about having the tactical plan to implement it and actually make sure that those are actionable. So when you say you want to accomplish something, you know, reverse engineer it and figure out how you get to that point, and then come up with a plan of action and make sure it is something that you are doing and accomplishing with your partners. I think that when people start to communicate, and we've seen it across the states and across a lot of the local jurisdictions, is the engagement in the private sector has really been, through COVID, so innovative and so supportive. And you know, you mentioned the distilleries and breweries stopping production to make hand sanitizer. There was a balloon company out in Kansas that wanted to make gloves. You see, you know, different organizations like Amazon building their COVID supply backbone capability that wasn't there before. You see Uber doing things like, you know, supporting moving of equipment and healthcare supplies for free through their Uber Freight, or helping to figure out or troubleshoot different transportation options as coastal communities are planning for hurricane season. You know, how do you evacuate in this environment? Hotels, you know, being tapped for potential non-congregate care or non-congregate sheltering in this COVID environment. You can't put a lot of people in a big place all together. We're gonna have to come up with different solutions. So I think the innovation is going to come through the partnerships. I think we've seen that over and over again through this event. And I think that we need, again, to leverage that to take advantage of what we've learned and how we can move forward and really build out the capabilities and the partnerships.
And we've talked a bunch here about resilience, and this is the Building Resilience Through PPP conference. And we've intentionally today spent a moment highlighting, hey, if we're going to look at PPPs through the lens of emergency management, homeland security, let's really look at what it's going to mean to move the needle on resilience. But I do want to say the response piece is still significant. I think by focusing on those partnerships, you know, I think we can start with a more deliberate approach. I think, you know, every community, here's some practical things. I've got a couple questions on what can we do in communities. Every community should develop a profile of who's in your community, which businesses, which industries, which community lifelines are in your community or outside your community that you rely on, which supply chains are inherent to your community or on the outside. You can do this using available data on business and industry profiles in your community. From there, we can ensure that we're including everybody. You look at this theme on social cohesion and equity through diversity and inclusion. We can do that if we actually have a true landscape of who's in our communities. Oftentimes, due to the tyranny of the urgent, or we have a quarter of a person or a 1-person or 2-person shop focused on private-public partnerships, we just go with the known players, with the big box stores and the big utilities and whatever. But those are important players because they're going to be critical through the lens of emergency management, especially to build, make more robust, mitigate, and stabilize those lifelines and supply chains before in the context of resilience, but then also in the context of response and recovery. Right? If we can actually make them as strong and resilient as possible before, and if we identify together in the context of PPPs, well, what's an acceptable level of service or a minimum required level of service for community to get to self-heal and get back up on their feet, you can start having those discussions around stabilization targets and what's it going to take in a post-boom environment to quickly get those supply chains and community lifelines working. And so if you do resilience right, you engage the entirety of your community and have an aperture to think about really including everybody and having all the equities in your community represented, you can have a more robust exchange. And you can quickly adapt that by, in that post-boom environment by setting up coordination calls and facilitating problem solving that's cross-sector oriented when it becomes complicated and when things really get hairy. A lot of times industries will self-heal and they can just do that within their own sort of structures that exist, or maybe you need to form a working group, but these things will happen easier versus right now. It's sort of like a lot of communities go out and they think, I need to create a new mechanism to engage the private sector. I think the first question you should ask in your community is, where's the private sector already self-organizing? And how can I have a seat at that table? And for the private sector, how and where does the government organize? And how can I have a seat at that table? And I think we need to use the existing infrastructure, use the existing platforms and mechanisms that are in place to do the planning and the assessment necessary, and to do the training that's necessary so that we can be adaptive when the response is required. So resilience lends itself towards a more efficient response versus trying to figure out on the fly on the tarmac, handing out cards and be like, oh, hey, nice to meet you finally, or I didn't even know you existed, right. And so we can be more efficient, and efficiency means lives, right? It means economic savings, right? It means people back up and returning to sort of normalcy or the ability to survive on their own again.
Yeah, so this isn't the end of the conversation. Again, we very much appreciate the Chamber asking us giving us the opportunity to do this session. Joel and I have a couple of questions for discussion and then call to action. So what are some aspirational outcomes of public-private partnerships? And we'd love your feedback. If you want to shoot us an email or you want to ping us on LinkedIn, we would love that. How can we better organize to achieve those outcomes? So what do we need to do? And as Joel mentioned, find out where your private sector is organizing, find out where your government's organizing. What additional guidance or resources do we need to be able to support this? And you may be a jurisdiction in a small state and you don't know where to start. What would you want to know? What are the questions you have? We would love to hear what type of guidance you think, because we can see it from a state and federal level, what guidance states are asking for, or what guidance the federal government's asking for, but what did private sector need for guidance? What do local jurisdictions need for guidance? So if you have ideas for that or questions you would want answered, we would love to hear that. And then Joel, I'll let you finish out with a call to action here, because I think that this is something else that we've been kind of not just crowdsourcing, but working within the organizations that we support and are engaged in to get this. But I think this forum gives us a broader opportunity to push out this call to action. So I'll let you explain this next part.
Yeah, it's really simple. As Shandi mentioned earlier, I think this season of disruption that we're in has highlighted and convinced people who maybe needed to be convinced of the role of private-public partnerships in emergency management in particular. And I'm sure a lot of you listening in today have examples of innovation that took place since COVID started. And also, as you've had to deal with other disasters in your communities. COVID's not the only thing that's been going on.
Or you're preparing for.
Yes, very, very good point. What innovations do you have from a preparedness mitigation standpoint, response, resilience, et cetera? What examples do you have of P3s at work in your community? We'd love to hear them. We're constantly collecting them, trying to build the collective body of knowledge in the community and share those, because they lend insight into what works, what can be scaled. Sometimes something that works isn't something that can be scaled, but it's really a great just example of innovation and adaptability. So anything that you have, please do share it. And then if you could do so, we're not asking for a lot. 300 to 500 words, that's a couple of paragraphs, of those examples that you have in your jurisdiction during the COVID response. So you're invited to not just listen to this conversation today, but to be part of the problem solving by sharing those examples, by sharing what you think those aspirational outcomes should be and how we can better organize to get there, and what resources are needed at the state and local level to really scale what's happening already. The evolution of PPPs is already happening. We've seen it grow at the state level, at the local level, within the private sector, on its own, really, and in some cases very intentionally, through coordinated efforts. But how can we really scale to the point where the need meets the demand, and the demand meets the need? I don't think we're there yet. I think right now, if I was to characterize where we are in a maturity model, I'd say we've got episodic engagement of P3s and some examples of some really mature, long-lasting programs that exist. How can we get beyond the episodic engagement that's in situ and constantly changing to this is the norm of how we do business, right? And how do we connect the dots where, okay, people over here, that is already their norm. It's not my norm. How do we connect the dots to make it everybody's norm? And so it's a collective win. A phrase I have on the bottom of my email signature, I've had it there for 15 years. It says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. So we need to have more inclusive, together-oriented thinking to get there. And it's slower, but if we go there together, we can get farther. So I'll leave you with that parting thought, and I'll turn it over to Shandi for the closing comments.
Yeah, so I just want to add one thing to the call to action. Yeah, so examples for innovation of how P3s are working in your community. I would also ask that if you within your organization are making these resilient investments, what are those? How did you convince leadership to make those investments? Those are things that I think everybody that's involved in this conference and has participated in the past would love to hear. What does that look like for you? Is it a multi-year plan? Is it one big chunk of money that you invested at one time? How does that look, and what are those things? So we'd love to see that. You can send those to Joel or myself or both of us. Our email addresses are here on this slide. Mine is just Shandi@em-partners.com. Joel's is jthomas@spinglobal.co, and that's co, not .com, .co. So again, we really appreciate everybody, tuning in today. I know this is, everybody says it's an unprecedented event, but I think that we have been able to overcome the distance by being able to engage in different events like this. Again, we want to thank the Chamber Foundation for including us. We think this is such a valuable platform, and we look forward to hearing more thoughts from everyone else on what they're doing and what they think we need to do moving forward, because we want to help drive that vision and that action forward.
With that, I think we're signing off. So thank you to all who participated. And again, thanks to the Chamber Foundation.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.